Okay, so hello everybody. It's a pleasure to talk to you all via the medium of amazing technology. I hope you can all hear me okay. If you can't, I suppose you could send a message through the chat and we can try and figure out why. But I'm just going to proceed as though you can hear me. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the research that my colleagues and I have been doing on wild jackdaws over the last few years. This is actually the image that you can see here is a time lapse of a jackdaw flock coming into roost. It's really quite a spectacular thing to see in real life and quite a spectacular thing to listen to as well. So, oh, now my slides are not advancing. Why is that happening? That's a bit weird. Sorry about that. Let's try again. There we go. Okay, so what you can see here is a picture of a jackdaw roost at night. And this is a sound that probably lots and lots of you are familiar with. So jackdaws are one of the most successful of our urban birds, if you like. So whereas the populations of most small songbirds are declining, the populations of jackdaws and other birds of the crow family are increasing, and we see them around us all the time. We see them in towns and cities, we see them in roosts in our parks and out in the countryside. And actually, even if you listen to, if you watch TV, a lot of the time the background track, whenever there's sort of images of the countryside, the background track is often the sound of jackdaws. So it's a very evocative sound. And these birds are interesting for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons why they're interesting is because they're remarkably clever. So these are birds of the crow family, and crows have become renowned over the last few years for being some of the most intelligent animals on Earth. Here I'm just showing you, as a comparison, a pigeon and a New Caledonian crow. These are two birds that are approximately similar in size, but the brain of the crow is about twice as large as the brain of the pigeon. So there's a lot of studies that have been conducted under laboratory conditions looking at various aspects of the cognitive performance of these birds. And we tend to find that in these psychological lab tests, birds of the crow family do as well, if not better, than primates, than our closest living relatives. But my interest really is to try and understand why. And so in order to understand that question, I take my research out of the lab and into the wild. And for the past 10 years or so, my colleagues and I have been studying jackdaws in the Cornish countryside. So we've established this project, which we call the Cornish Jackdaw Project, spread across various different sites in the west of Cornwall. And we have over 2,000 colour-ringed individuals now. So each bird, as you can see in the photograph, is fitted with a unique combination of coloured rings, and one of the rings actually contains a little embedded pit tag inside it, a little RFID chip, which also allows us to monitor the bird's social networks when they come and visit feeders or when they arrive at nest boxes that have loggers embedded in them. And so really our aim with this project is to try and understand what it is about the lives of these birds that have driven the evolution of intelligence, if you like. Or to be more specific, we look at the development and evolution of the communication abilities, the cognitive abilities, and also culture. In other words, how birds can learn from each other, how this leads to ideas spreading through groups. But today I'm going to focus specifically on vocal communication, what we can learn by studying vocal communication in these birds. So an important message to get across before we start delving into some of the research findings is that these birds have distinct voices. So just like your voice sounds different to mine, the voice of one jackdaw sounds different to another jackdaw. So some of these differences are audible to the human ear, others are not really that evident to us, but we can detect them if we do acoustic analyses. And so that means that there are opportunities for individuals to track each other by voice. And you'll hear them. So when they fly overhead, you'll often hear jackdaws calling to each other. These are very garrulous birds. They're always chattering away to each other. So in this talk, we are going to look at how jackdaws use their vocalizations in a few different contexts. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about coordination. So these are highly social birds, and they use their vocalizations to help coordinate their movements. So we're going to be looking at that. We'll also look at the issue of consensus decision-making. So if large groups of individuals need to come to an agreement, they need to come to a consensus, how might their vocalizations play a role in allowing them to do that? And then finally, we'll think a little bit about their vocalizations in the context of change. So obviously, conditions are changing to a very large degree. And as I mentioned, these are birds that are very adaptable. They're very good at coping with change. They're very good at living alongside people. So we'll be thinking about what impacts that might have in terms of their ability to respond to new threats, but also in terms of how pollution might have an impact on the way that they communicate. So we'll start off with this question of coordination, and particularly I want to think about mobbing. So mobbing occurs when groups of animals gather together to drive away a predator. So in this case, we've got a group of animals gathering together to drive away a bird of prey. And this is quite a common phenomenon. We see it throughout the animal kingdom, in birds, and fish, and mammals. And in the jackdaws, we've been looking at the role of vocal communication. So an important thing to remember here is that getting close to a predator is potentially a risky thing to do. So we might expect animals to make strategic decisions about when to get involved in these sorts of mobbing events. And what the jackdaws do when they spot a predator is they make a distinctive alarm call. We call it a scolding call that basically serves as a recruitment call. And so hopefully this will work. But I shall play you what that sounds like here. Okay, so hopefully you could hear that. So you'll probably have heard this sound when the jackdaws are flying overhead. So normally the jackdaws have quite a sweet voice compared to the other birds of the crow family, but their alarm calls sound more similar to the caw of a crow or a rook. And so these alarm calls, these recruitment calls, are interesting because when a bird hears one, it needs to make a decision. Often you might have, a jackdaw that's spotted a potential threat out in a field and it starts alarm calling, and birds will come and join in from quite a long distance away. And so when they hear these calls, the birds are thinking, there's an alarm. Is there a predator attacking? They need to make a decision. Should I join the mob to help drive away the predator, potentially at a risk to themselves? So we've done a lot of experiments where we put loudspeakers out in fields, and we have remote controls that allow us to operate the loudspeakers from a distance, and then we can video the responses of the birds. So I'll show you an example of what that looks like here. Hopefully this will work. So there's no sound in this particular video, but there's a speaker out here in this open field playing alarm calls, and you'll see that birds start arriving in response to the calls. So you get this assembly of birds that fly overhead when they start to hear the sound coming out of the speaker. And so a nice thing about this is that we can fairly easily then just count the number of birds that's arriving. And so that gives us a nice way of measuring the magnitude of the response. So one of the first experiments that we did using these recruitment calls was by my former PhD student, Richard Woods. So one of the things that Richard looked at was whether the birds care who's calling in terms of their familiarity. So jackdaws live in the colony breeders, so they occupy these nest box colonies. And so within a colony, all the birds will know each other. But what Richard did was he played back recordings of the calls of birds from a particular colony, or strangers from a different colony who the focal birds would never have encountered before. And so what you can see in the graph here is that this has a big impact on recruitment. So if we're playing back the calls of a colony member, a familiar individual, you get higher levels of recruitment, bigger mobs turning up than if they are hearing the calls of strangers. So here familiarity seems to be important. That it seems that the birds are more likely to join in this potentially risky mobbing event if they're hearing somebody they know compared to somebody who they don't know. And we've also found that the birds take into account how many birds are calling. So this is an experiment run by Jenny Coombs, who did a master's by research with me a couple of years ago. And so what Jenny did was to test the idea that the jackdaws might actually be effectively counting how many birds are already involved in a mobbing event. Now, you can imagine that if I am going to go and join a mobbing event on my own, say that there's one individual calling and I decide to join, that is much riskier than if there are multiple individuals calling. The per capita risk is going to decline when you have a bigger group, and a bigger group's also more likely to be effective in driving away a predator. So what Jenny did was she ran playback experiments in where she had different conditions, where she's playing back the exact same number of calls, of individual calls, but those calls are produced by different numbers of individuals. So in our little schematic here, we have 5 calls that all come from a bird we shall call Bob. And in the middle, we can see that here now we've still got 5 calls, but those 5 calls come from 3 different callers, Bob, Rich, and Mike. And in our final condition, we still have 5 calls, but they come from 5 different individuals. And so the question is, when we're doing these playbacks, how does that influence the recruitment? And as predicted, what we find is that the more callers are involved, the larger the number of recruits. So you can see here the red dots are the mean and the standard error in our different conditions. And there's a clear detectable increase in the number of recruits that you get when you're playing 5 callers as compared to 1 caller. So this, I think, has some interesting implications, because actually a lot of the time when people think about collective behavior in animals, the assumption is that this is underpinned by very simple mechanisms, that you've got these very simple rules that allow individuals to coordinate, and that may well be true, but actually what these experiments suggest is that there's some additional cognitive complexity. So in particular, what we find is that when birds are making these mobbing decisions, they're having to employ individual vocal discrimination, so they're able to tell apart the calls of different individuals, and they deploy a level of numerical competence in that they're able to say to themselves, I can hear X many individuals calling, and that is going to impact their decision as to whether or not to join in mobbing events. An additional thing that we haven't really looked at here, that we're hoping to run some additional experiments on, is whether there might actually be effects of reputation. So we've got some evidence that this is the case, because, for example, if you play back the alarm calls of a particular individual repeatedly, so basically you make it seem as though it's crying wolf, it's shouting that there's a predator when there isn't really a predator around, all the other birds stop responding to that individual. And so it'd be interesting to know whether those sort of reputational effects might also carry over into different contexts. So we've seen that these calls play an important role in allowing the birds to coordinate their mobbing decisions when they're responding to predators. Now, what I'm going to show you next is a little bit more speculative, but bear with me. So the idea here is that not only do these birds gather together to join to mob predators, but actually they also form very large flocks. Some of you may well have seen these. So particularly at this time of the year during the winter, you'll see big groups of jackdaws coming together en masse, coming back to spend the night in their winter roosts. And these flocks really are spectacular. People often rave about, the fantastic murmurations that you see starlings performing, but jackdaws do something pretty similar. I'm going to show you a video of what this looks like. So this is a flock that's coming in just towards the roosting site. As you can see, they engage in these really spectacular displays. Here we've got a group that's split and it merges in a second. Got some laggards coming behind. So this really is quite a mesmerizing thing to watch. And over the past few years, we've been working with colleagues in Stanford to actually try and reconstruct the movements of all of these birds in 3 dimensions. So the way that we do this is we have a set of high-speed cameras put out in the field in the areas where we know the birds are likely to fly overhead. And before the birds arrive, we'll fly a drone around over the cameras. And so we can use that to calibrate space effectively, because each camera is looking at the same thing. They're all looking at the drones. And so we can create a 3-dimensional map of space. So then when the birds come through on their way to roost, we can actually capture the movements of each individual and recreate it in 3 dimensions, which is what we see here in the panel on the right. So the really striking thing when you start to do this is that actually, although clearly there's a cohesive flock, the flock actually has internal structure. In particular, you see that these birds are flying in pairs. You can see that, and that's illustrated here, where the red dots are birds that are paired up. So these are birds who are responding much more to one particular individual than to any other individual within the group. And this makes a lot of sense when you think about the structure of jackdaw societies, because jackdaws form lifelong monogamous pair bonds. And so it would be extremely costly to lose your partner. And so given that, they pay very close attention to the movements of their partner within these crowds, within these flocks, and they really follow each other very, very carefully. So this is interesting from all sorts of points of view regarding collective behavior, but the reason I bring it up here is that we suspect, we don't know this for sure, but we suspect that vocalizations play an important role, because when you hear jackdaws flying overhead, these flocks aren't quiet, they're pretty noisy. And so what you're likely to have is effectively something like a cocktail party effect, where, you know, if you think about being in a cocktail party, one of the challenges there is that you're having to pick out the voices of the people you're talking to over the general hubbub of all the other people at the party. Well, the jackdaws also seem to be having to do this, but they're doing it while flying at 40 miles an hour in a crowd sometimes of thousands of other individuals. So it seems very likely that they are responding to the calls of their partner and using that to help track them within these crowds. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the question of consensus decision making. So again, here we're going back to this image of birds in a roost. And so the birds they come into the roost in the evenings, they spend their night in the roost, and then in the morning they wake up and they need to decide when to leave. Now, there are important advantages, potential advantages to leaving the roost together. So if individuals are able to leave the roost at the same time, then that will reduce the predation risk, and it may also have important advantages in terms of information transmission, because, for example, if you and I are in the roost together and I can see that you've been particularly well fed last night, there may be important advantages to me being able to follow you to foraging sites. And so we see this in a lot of birds, that they seem to leave roosts together. So we were interested to know whether perhaps their vocalizations played a role in allowing them to make this decision, because after all, each individual is likely to have a slightly different preference depending on their social associates within the roost, depending on how well fed they are, depending on their condition, and so on. So in order to decide to leave the roost together, they've got to overcome their differences to come to a consensus decision. And so something that's really striking when you go and visit these roosts in the early morning is that they're very noisy. And so I'm going to play you a little example. Hopefully, again, this will work, what this sounds like. So hopefully you could hear there that the calling seems to build up to a crescendo. That's what we often hear, that, you know, if you go a long time before sunrise, you'll start to hear one or two birds calling, and then over time more and more birds join in, and then it builds and builds and builds to a crescendo. And when you reach that point of crescendo, that's the point when all of these birds suddenly seem to leave the roost. So in a study led by another master's student of mine, Alex Thornton, we tried to unravel the decision-making processes at play here. So what Alex did is he went out and he put a load of these automated recorders across 6 different roosts in Cornwall. And he had, within each roost, there was a grid of recorders with between 4 and 6 recorders, depending on the size of the roost. And the size of these roosts were pretty variable. So we had fairly small ones with 160 birds, going all the way up to almost 1,500 birds in the roost. And you do get far, far bigger roosts than that as well, but these are the ones that we studied. And so what Alex then did is took these recordings and processed them. First of all, he processed them in MATLAB to try and understand the profile of changes in vocalizations over time. So here you can see an example of this. So we've got time until departure on the y-axis and the calling intensity on, time until departure on the x-axis and calling intensity on the y-axis. So here we've calculated power spectral density, which is a measure of the power in decibels of each frequency component of the calls in each second. And so we can use that to see how calling intensity changes over time. And this is, an example that shows how the calling intensity increases until the moment indicated here at 0 when the birds leave. So when we analyze these data, we see some pretty striking effects. So first of all, there seem to be important relationships between calling and when the birds are leaving the roost. So when this rate of calling increases more steeply, then the birds will leave earlier. So you can see that here on this graph where we've got calling intensity, the rate of change in calling intensity on the y-axis. And when that is higher, the groups leave earlier relative to sunrise. So they usually will leave pretty close to sunrise, but they might leave a little bit before, a little bit after. And when the rate of intensity in calling increases at a steeper rate, they tend to leave earlier. And we also see this very striking effect that when the final calling intensity, so this is a calling intensity in the final minute before departure, when that is really high, you tend to see that a far larger proportion of the roost depart together. And this follows this really striking non-linear relationship. So this is reminiscent of work on quorum sensing, where you have this sudden flip, where once the calling intensity reaches somewhere between -80 and -70 decibels per hertz, you suddenly have this flip where at this point almost all of the birds in the roost, 100% of the birds in the roost often, will leave together. And when this happens, these decisions really seem to be almost simultaneous. Within the space of a couple of seconds, you go from having a roost full of thousands of birds sometimes to no birds at all. And so that really seems to be linked to this, this rise in calling intensity reaching a particular peak. And I'm going to show you a video of what this looks like. Again, here, this is just a video with no sound. So this is in Gweek in Cornwall, next to the docks. And at the top of these trees, there are lots and lots of birds. It's hard to see them at the moment, but you'll see them in a second when they all lift off. So as you can see, in the space of a couple of seconds, all of these birds have suddenly just departed. And it's a really, really striking thing to see. You can see, the sky is just full of these little black dots. It's like a black snowstorm almost. So there seems to be these very strong correlations between the vocalizations that the birds are making in the roost and these cohesive group departures. But of course, as we all know, correlation does not imply causation. So in order to test whether there was actually a causal effect of the jackdaws calling on these group departures, we ran a playback experiment. So again, we used these remote control loudspeakers, where we have multiple loudspeakers in each roost, and we would play back one of 3 different conditions. We either had a control where there's no playback at all, or a control where we played back wind noise that was matched to the amplitude of jackdaw calls, or we played jackdaw calls. And so as you can see here, when we played jackdaw calls early, so we started playing them before the birds would normally depart, this caused the birds to depart earlier than they would otherwise. So we've got a decline in the departure time relative to sunrise. And this is specific to jackdaw calls. So it wasn't triggered by any old noise. So when we played wind noise, we didn't see this effect. So it really does seem that this is a very specific response to the calls of the jackdaws. Interestingly, there was one case where we were filming where we saw that we had this huge group departure of loads and loads and loads of jackdaws, and then left behind were two birds. And you think, well, why didn't those two birds depart? And interestingly, it's because those two birds were carrion crows. They were a different species, so they didn't seem to respond to the calls of the jackdaws in the same way. So it does seem to be a species-specific response in response to their own calls that allows them to make this consensus decision. And this is interesting because most previous work on consensus decision making in animals has focused on pretty small groups or family groups where individuals' interests are going to be largely aligned, whereas here we're dealing with really, really large groups of dispersed individuals that will contain both kin and non-kin, and nevertheless they're able to use their vocalizations to establish a group consensus. So when this was reported in the media, people talked about it as jackdaw democracy. And finally, I feel like I'm rushing through this a little bit, but never mind. I want to talk to you a little bit about what we know about communication in a changing world in these birds. So jackdaws, as I mentioned, they're good at coping with life alongside humans. You know, humans create a lot of problems, but they also create opportunities. This particular jackdaw has picked up on the opportunity to nab a tasty snack by visiting somebody's table. But the flip side of these opportunities is that there are also risks and challenges. So one challenge, of course, is that when these birds live alongside humans, they're exposed to increasing levels of disturbance in the form of light pollution, noise pollution, and that may well have an impact on their ability to communicate with one another. And jackdaws, like other birds of the crow family, are also often persecuted. They're treated as vermin. So I found this beautiful little thing on the internet, but if you happen to live in Northern Ireland and you want somebody to come and shoot your jackdaws, apparently you can have that done. And we know that jackdaws are widely persecuted. They're persecuted here in Cornwall, they were persecuted in Cambridge where I used to live, and so that creates a big problem for these birds. On the one hand, you have opportunities from living alongside people, and on the other hand, some of these people might try and shoot you. And so that it forms the basis of an experiment that my PhD student Victoria Lee ran a few years ago. So we were thinking about the fact that for these jackdaws, you know, they're around people a lot, and if they spent their entire time being terrified of every person they saw, they'd never get anything done. You know, they wouldn't be able to forage, they wouldn't be able to care for their chicks if they were in a constant state of heightened alarm every time they saw anybody. So we speculated that it might be useful for them to be able to discriminate between people who pose a threat and people who don't pose a threat. And in fact, in a previous experiment with another PhD student called Gabrielle Davidson, we showed that individuals, these jackdaws, are able to learn from their own experience of different people who poses a threat and who doesn't. So what Victoria wanted to do was ask whether they can also learn not only from their own experience, but if they can learn socially from the experiences of others. And if you think about it, that's likely to be a very useful thing to do. So if I'm going to learn about a potential predator, say a potential danger, it's far better if I can learn from your experiences rather than having to experience the threat myself, because I might well end up dead if I've had to experience a dangerous predator on my own. And so what Victoria did in this experiment was she wore one of two different masks. So we wanted to see if the jackdaws were specifically learning to discriminate between faces. So we controlled the person, we controlled the clothes they were wearing, everything else was controlled. And what Victoria did was she went and sat on a chair in front of one of the jackdaws' nest boxes while wearing one of these two faces. So this is our baseline step to see how the birds would respond in the absence of any prior experience. She then paired this in a training phase with playbacks of alarm calls. So I'll play that again. So here the jackdaws are seeing a new person and they're hearing another jackdaw shouting that there's danger. Or in another condition, you'd have the exact same situation, but here, I don't know if you can hear that, but that is the contact call of a jackdaw, which basically says everything is okay. So you've got these two training situations. And so we were interested in knowing, well, does this training have an effect? And that is exactly what we find. So here we can see the baseline. So this is before the birds have had any experience. And here birds who were in the contact call or the scold call conditions, they didn't differ. But after they've had training, those individuals who'd seen a person associated with scold calls came back to their nests much more quickly. So this is a defensive behaviour in jackdaws, where when they see something they don't like, they'll come back to the nest to protect the chicks. Whereas in contrast, when the new novel person had been associated with contact calls, you don't see this effect. In fact, if anything, the birds became a bit more relaxed. So it seems that by hearing the calls of other individuals when seeing a new person, the jackdaws could quickly learn whether this person is going to be a threat or not. And I've got just a little video here to illustrate what happens. So this is a jackdaw that's come back to see somebody who it has learnt is likely to be threatening. So as you can see, they're very vigilant. They're peering down at Victoria in her mask, sitting in a chair. And then pops back into the nest box. So vocalizations clearly play a really important role in allowing birds to learn about danger, because it allows them to learn not only from their own experiences, but to learn from the experiences of others. And we think that that's probably likely to play an important role in allowing jackdaws to be flexible and to exploit the opportunities associated with living alongside people. But of course, living near people also has its challenges. And this is something that another master's student, Anna Smith, focused on. So Anna was particularly interested in looking at the effects of anthropogenic disturbance on the birds calling within the roosts. So the map here just illustrates levels of light pollution across different parts of Cornwall, with the yellow being particularly highly disturbed areas. So I'm sitting down here in Falmouth, and the darker green areas are areas of the countryside where you have less light pollution. So you've got these issues of light pollution, and you've also got issues of noise. So the photograph here on the right is a bizarre little jackdaw roost. So up in these trees here, there's a roost where about 200 jackdaws or so come in every evening throughout the winter. And as you can see, it's right outside the Wetherspoons pub. So these birds are not only having to contend with light from the town, but also the noise of people spilling in and out of the pub, cars driving past, people having arguments and so on. So what Anna did is she placed recorders in multiple different roosts across different areas. So some of them were in very disturbed areas, like outside the pub. Others were right in the depths of the countryside. And she used these recorders to try and understand how calling behaviour relates to the levels of disturbance. So one thing that we see is that when the birds arrive at the roost, they initially arrive and they're all chatting to each other and calling. And over a period of about an hour or so, they gradually settle down. So you can see that illustrated here in the spectrogram, that the level of calling declines after arrival. But when the birds are in more disturbed areas, they take longer to settle down. So they spend more of their time calling. So you can see here, there's a strong relationship between the amount of urban area coverage on the y-axis and the rate of change in calling intensity, such that in areas where there's a high level of urban area coverage, they take longer to settle down. We also see an effect that when the birds wake up in the morning, there's an effect on their calling again. So if you remember when we were looking at consensus decision making, it seems that when calling increases more steeply, the birds leave earlier, and when it reaches a higher peak level, they're more likely to leave cohesively. Well, we have some evidence here that actually human disturbance might interrupt this, or might have effects on the bird's ability to reach these consensuses. So here we see that when birds are closer to a road, here on the y-axis, the rate of increase in calling intensity is lower. So that suggests that perhaps the disturbance created by road noise might impede the bird's ability to respond to one another and to have these positive feedback loops that lead to their calling increasing at increasing rates. And finally, we also looked to see what was going on during the night. So generally, if you go to a jackdaw roost out in the depths of the countryside and you sit there during the night, it's pretty quiet. The birds don't really seem to be making much noise. Once in a while you might hear one or two birds calling, but basically it's quiet. But what we find is that in areas with high levels of artificial brightness, the birds spend much more of their time calling. In some cases, you know, even up to about 70% of their time was spent calling throughout the night. And we also see an effect if we look on a smaller scale. So if we look when there was a particular anthropogenic sound, say a car driving past or somebody shouting or whatever it might be, you see a detectable increase in calling as well. So this indicates that human disturbance is making these birds call during the night. And of course, if they're calling, that presumably means that they're not asleep. So this is starting to make us wonder whether actually human disturbance might have important effects on sleep deprivation in wild animals. And we know from research on humans that this could have really quite substantial consequences. So in humans, there's work showing that having one bad night's sleep is more or less equivalent to being blind drunk in terms of how it affects your performance on cognitive tasks. So if by making the world increasingly noisy, we are actually affecting animals' ability to sleep during the night, this might well have all sorts of unintended consequences, including limiting the animal's ability to use their cognitive processes to respond to environmental change, which is rather worrying. And we're doing some more work at the moment to try and look in more detail at how the birds are responding to the disturbance around them. So hopefully I've shown you that these birds' abilities to vocalize and the fact that they have individually distinctive calls plays a really important role in allowing them to coordinate. So we've got strong evidence that it plays a role in the coordination of these mobbing events when they're mobbing predators. And we speculate that it might also allow them to keep track of their partners when they're flying within these big flocks. Again, this is a time-lapse image of one big flock doing a collective turn where they suddenly move back on themselves. And if you look carefully, you can probably see that there's distinctive pairs quite evident within this image. We also see that the vocalizations allow the birds to reach a consensus in the morning, so to decide when to leave together. And if this consensus isn't reached, then rather than leaving in a big group, the birds will leave in smaller groups in dribs and drabs. And finally, we've seen that vocalizations can allow individuals to respond to change. Like it can allow them to, for example, learn about which people are dangerous and which people are not dangerous. But also the fact that we're changing the environments that these animals live in might limit their abilities to communicate with each other. So it might make it harder for them to establish these consensus decisions if it impacts the way that the vocalizations mount during the morning, and it may also have an impact on their sleep during the night. So I think with that, I shall end and just say thank you to all of you for listening, and thank you to the kind funders who've given us money to do this work over the last few years. And if there are any questions, I would be very, very happy to answer them. So I can see there's one question here on the chat from Connor Tickner. Thank you very much, Connor. I'll read it out. So with respect to mob recruitment, numerical comprehension was mentioned. Please can you elaborate and clarify on the understanding of that? It wasn't clear to me whether they were shown to have a numerical understanding specifically, or if it was more just a general sense of group scale, i.e. few versus lots. Yeah, that's a very interesting point, Connor. I think I can't give you a detailed answer because we haven't looked in detail at the specific cognitive mechanisms. So there is a sort of general level effect where they can tell the difference between lots of callers and few callers, and they're doing that by discriminating between individual calls, because we're always playing, the number of calls is always the same. But whether they are able to discriminate between 7 and 8, for example, that would require further research for us to look at. We've got another question that's just come in from Zuzu Yang, who asks, do you think playing bird communication sounds manually can increase biodiversity? Wow, that's an interesting question. I mean, we do know that we can change patterns of behavior by playing calls. We saw that, for example, in the experiment on consensus decision making. We can get the birds to leave earlier in the morning. And there's also work showing that if you play bird calls, that can, for example, attract other birds to an area. So from that point of view, it could play a role, for example, in getting birds to come to, if there's an area where you'd like to encourage breeding, there's a potential role there. We also need to be a little bit careful, of course, because there's obviously going to be competition effects as well. So if you're broadcasting sounds that indicate that there's already lots of individuals here, that could actually have the effect of putting off other individuals from arriving. And we might also see competition between species. So, for example, if we're playing the calls of birds like jackdaws, that could potentially put off birds of other species from arriving in an area. So yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think there could be a role, but we need to be very careful in how we apply it. I'm seeing there's another question from Tom Ewing. Thank you, Tom. Is there potential for this information to be used against the birds? For example, farmers using distress noise to disperse birds to prevent damage to crops? That's a really interesting question. I mean, from one perspective, that would be far preferable than using lethal deterrence, which is what people often do. But I suspect that the answer to your question, Tom, is probably no, because the birds habituate. So if they encounter the same stimulus over and over again, they stop responding. And actually, we find this with playback experiments. So when we run these playbacks, we need to be very careful to make sure that we spread them out and don't do too many playbacks in a particular area, because if we do them very repeatedly, the birds just stop responding. And so in the same way that, for example, scarecrows don't work because birds very quickly learn that the scarecrow is not a threat and they learn to ignore it. If you continually played the same kind of distress sound, the birds would habituate to that. However, if you alter it, so the trick would be to make things unpredictable, so you have different calls that come at different unpredictable times, then that could potentially play a role. And it might be useful in terms of reducing human-wildlife conflict. I think that those are all the questions I've got so far. If anybody else has any questions, please do feel free to post them. I don't know can people actually speak on this thing? If so, do feel free to ask your question out loud as well. I'll stay on here for another couple of minutes just in case anything else comes up. And otherwise, thank you all very much for coming. Okay, it looks like people are departing.